She stepped off that stagecoach in a silk dress and buttoned gloves, and every jaw on the street dropped, including the man who had paid to marry her. Gideon Thorne had written for a frontier wife. What arrived looked like she belonged in a Boston parlor, not a Rocky Mountain winter that killed grown men without apology. He almost turned around right there, almost left her standing in the dirt with her trunks and her dignity. But Evelyn Ashcroft didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't ask him to stay. She just looked at him like she already knew what he was going to do, and dared him to do it anyway. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, this story is for you. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which gave Gideon Thorne 40 minutes standing in the cold outside Pryor's general store to reconsider every decision he had made in the last 6 months. He leaned against the hitching post with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, watching a drunk argue with a mule across the street. The town of Ash Hollow wasn't much. A post office, a saloon, a livery, a church with a cracked bell, and maybe 200 people who had either stopped running or hadn't yet figured out they should start. Dust came off everything. The mountains behind the buildings were already wearing snow on their upper shoulders, and the wind sliding down from those peaks had teeth in it even in October. Gideon didn't mind cold. He'd spent 15 winters above the tree line in a cabin he'd built himself from timber. He'd felled himself, and cold was just a condition of living up there. What he minded was uncertainty. He'd sent for a bride because the last winter had nearly killed him. Not from cold, not from any bear or ex-accident, but from the particular silence of 4 months completely alone. A man could only talk to himself so long before the walls started talking back. So he'd written to a placement service out of St. Louis, paid the fee, filled out the form with his square, careful handwriting, the same handwriting he used to track animal movements and weather patterns in his log. Must be sturdy. Must not fear solitude. Must be capable of hard work without complaint. He hadn't asked for pretty. He hadn't asked for educated. He'd asked for someone who could survive where he lived. The coach rolled in trailing dust and noise. 4 passengers climbed out. A heavy-set merchant squinting at a paper. A young man with a bruised eye who moved like he was hoping nobody noticed him. An older woman clutching a hat box. And then her. Gideon saw the gloves first, white, buttoned at the wrist, the kind of gloves that had never done a day of actual work. Then the dress. Deep blue wool, fitted at the waist, with a small brooch at the collar. Her hair was dark, pinned up under a narrow-brimmed hat that would last approximately 1 Rocky Mountain windstorm before flying into a canyon. She carried herself straight-backed, moving carefully on the uneven boards of the stage stop landing, and she was scanning faces with calm, deliberate attention. Her eyes found him before he figured out what to say. She walked over without hesitation. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was clear and measured, the voice of someone who had spent years being precise with words. "Yeah," he said. She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. He noticed that at least, but her hand was smooth, uncalloused, and that told him everything he thought he needed to know. "I'm Evelyn Ashcroft." She studied him the same way he was studying her, openly and without embarrassment. "You're taller than I expected." "You're not what I expected either," he said, and he didn't soften it. She didn't look wounded. "I imagine not." She turned slightly toward the luggage being unloaded from the coach roof. "I have 2 trunks." He looked at the trunks. They were large, dark-stained wood with brass fittings, the kind of trunks that cost more than most people in Ash Hollow made in a month. He looked at them and felt something settle uneasily in his chest. "We're traveling by wagon," he said. "Up a mountain, not to a hotel. I'm aware of where we're traveling. Those trunks weigh more than my mule would like." "I'll manage the weight distribution," she said calmly, as if that were a sentence anyone said. He stared at her. She met his stare without blinking. "Miss Ashcroft." He pulled his hat off and scratched the back of his neck. There was no polite way to say what he needed to say, so he said it anyway. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." She turned to face him fully. "In what sense?" "The sense where I asked for someone who could handle the frontier, and you look like you just came from a symphony." A beat of silence. A wagon clattered past on the street behind them. "Did I misrepresent myself in my letters?" she asked. "You didn't say anything about—" He gestured vaguely at her. All of her. The gloves, the brooch, the posture. No, she agreed. I didn't, but you didn't ask. You stated your requirements, and I responded to them. I said I was not afraid of hard work. I said I did not require comfort. I said I could endure solitude. Her eyes were steady. Dark brown, he noticed. Completely level. Were any of those things untrue? I don't know yet. Then perhaps, she said, you should withhold your judgment until you do. He put his hat back on. He looked at the trunks again, then at the mountains above the rooftops, then back at this woman who was watching him like she was waiting for him to say something reasonable. He wasn't at all sure this was a good idea, but he had paid for the fare, and he had made a commitment. And Gideon Thorne, whatever else he was, did not walk away from commitments. I'll get the wagon, he said. Yeah. They were married an hour later by a circuit preacher who smelled like pipe tobacco and rushed through the vows with the efficiency of a man who had somewhere better to be. Evelyn said her words clearly. Gideon said his quietly. There were no flowers, no guests, no celebration afterward, just a handshake with the preacher, a signature in his register, and the two of them standing in the cold outside the church like two strangers who had just signed a business contract, which was more or less what they had done. You hungry? Gideon asked. I could eat. He took her to the one place in Ash Hollow that served food, a back room behind the saloon where a woman named Hester sold stew and biscuits from a pot she kept going all day. They sat across from each other at a rough plank table, and Evelyn ate the stew without complaining about what was in it, which earned her a small, silent point in Gideon's private accounting. How long have you been in St. Louis? He asked. 3 years. And before that? A pause. Brief, but there. Boston. Long way to come for a marriage advertisement. She broke a biscuit in half. How long have you been in the mountains? 15 years. She looked up. Alone? Mostly. She considered that. That's a long time. It is. Did you have a wife before? No. She nodded, not pressing. He appreciated that. The placement service said you were a trapper and a trader, she said. Was. Now I mostly trade. I know the supply routes better than anyone in 3 counties. Merchants pay me to move goods through passes the standard routes can't handle in winter. He paused. It's good work. Pays well. And the cabin? 2 rooms, a loft, root cellar, smokehouse out back. He watched her face for signs of dismay and found none. No neighbors for 11 miles. She nodded again. That same unhurried processing. I should tell you something, she said. All right. I am not what you imagined. She said it plainly, without apology. I know that. I saw your face when I stepped off that coach. But I need you to know that I am also not someone who gives up easily. I don't require you to like me. I don't require comfort or praise. I require only a fair chance to prove I can carry my share. She looked at him directly. Can you give me that? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not just as a politeness. Yeah, he said. I can do that. She nodded once, like that settled something, and went back to her stew. They left at dawn the next morning, before the town properly woke. Gideon loaded the wagon with the last supplies they'd need before winter sealed the passes: flour, salt, lamp oil, ammunition, a replacement blade for the axe, and lashed her 2 trunks to the back with rope, fitting them around the supply crates with more care than he'd admitted to himself he was taking. Evelyn had appeared at the livery at first light wearing different clothes, a dark gray skirt, heavy wool, and a proper coat with deep pockets. Sturdy boots, he noted with some surprise. Not the delicate things she'd worn the day before. Her hair was pinned back practically rather than elegantly. She had assessed the situation overnight and adapted. He filed that away. She climbed up onto the wagon bench without asking for help, which also went into the filing. The first stretch of road out of Ash Hollow was manageable. Worn wagon ruts through scrubby high desert country, dry creek beds, occasional clusters of cottonwood going gold in the autumn. The mountains waited ahead, their peaks cutting into a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Gideon drove. Evelyn sat beside him with her hands in her lap, watching the landscape move past. For the first 2 hours, they barely spoke. That suited him. He was accustomed to silence, and she seemed, strangely, to be the same. "What are the winters like?" she asked eventually. "Bad." "How bad?" "Temperatures can go to 30 below. Snow past the windowsills. Sometimes you don't leave the cabin for 3 weeks straight because the wind makes it not worth trying." She was quiet for a moment. "And water?" "There's a creek 50 yards from the cabin. Freezes about January. After that you melt snow." "Firewood supply?" He looked at her sideways. "I cut it through the fall. Keep a large pile." "How large?" "Large enough." He paused. "Why?" "I'm calculating what I'll need to learn," she said, as if this were obvious. "In order of urgency." He didn't respond immediately, recalibrating something in his assessment of her without quite wanting to. "You've never done any of this," he said. "Not this specifically, no. But you're not frightened." She thought about that with an honesty that surprised him. "I'm anxious," she said. "That's different. Fear makes you freeze. Anxiety just means you're paying attention." He drove for a while without answering. "That's not a bad distinction," he said at last. Bum. The road stopped being a road around midday. This was the moment, Gideon knew from experience, where people who thought they wanted the frontier realized they didn't. When the wagon wheel began climbing actual rock, when the trees closed in, when the trail narrowed to barely wider than the axles, and the drop on the right side became a genuine cliff face, this was when people started reconsidering. He glanced at Evelyn. She was looking at the cliff, not in panic, but with the focused attention of someone doing precise arithmetic. The trail cut along the edge of a long, rocky bluff, a stretch Gideon had traveled 100 times and respected every time. The mules knew it too and slowed without being told, picking their steps carefully. He gave them the reins loosely and let them work. This was the kind of place where a driver who grabbed too hard made things worse. They were 3/4 of the way across when one of the rear wheels hit a loose shelf of shale. He felt it before he heard it. The sudden wrongness of the wagon's balance, the way the back end began drifting toward the edge without drama, almost politely, like something sliding off a shelf. The mules felt it too and surged forward instinctively, which was exactly the wrong response. "Whoa!" He stood, pulling back on the reins. "Whoa!" But the wheel had found the edge. The back right corner of the wagon dropped 6 inches, then stopped, teetering with the rear trunks hanging over open air. Evelyn did not scream. "Don't move," Gideon said. "I'm not moving." The mules were fighting the reins. If they lurched forward, the shift in weight would take the back over completely. He had to ease them, had to hold them steady, while simultaneously, he calculated this in the span of 2 seconds, getting to the back of the wagon and shifting that weight inward before the whole thing went. "Can you hold the reins?" he asked. She turned her head slowly. "I've never driven mules." "You hold. You don't drive. Keep even pressure. Don't pull hard. Just hold." "All right." She took the reins from his hands. He felt them transferred with no fumbling. He moved to the back of the wagon, slow as he could manage, feeling every creak of the boards under him, watching the cliff edge come into his peripheral vision below him. The 2 trunks had shifted toward the edge. He braced his legs on the wheel hub, grabbed the nearest trunk by its brass handle, and pulled. It didn't budge. Too heavy. He tried differently, bracing with his whole back, driving with his legs. And the trunk scraped inward 3 inches, 4, enough to shift the balance just slightly back toward solid ground. "Easy," he said to the mules, to Evelyn, to the situation in general. "They're calm," Evelyn said, steady. "I've got them." He got to the second trunk, same process, same grinding effort. His boots scrabbled on the wagon boards. Below the wheel edge, he could see the drop. 60, 70 feet of open air onto broken rock. He didn't look at it again. The wagon shuddered, swayed, then settled. All 4 wheels on solid ground. The trunk centered. He let out a breath. "You can ease the reins," he said. He came back around and took them from her. Her hands, he noticed, were completely steady. No trembling. Her face had gone somewhat pale, but her jaw was set and her eyes were clear. "That's going to happen again?" she asked. "Not that exact spot, but similar." She nodded. "Then teach me the right way to handle the mules when it does." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman in her practical wool coat with her two heavy trunks and her steady hands. "Yeah," he said. "All right." They reached the cabin near dark. It was exactly what he'd described and nothing more. A low-roofed structure of hand-cut logs, a stone chimney, two shuttered windows, the smokehouse out back, a woodpile stacked against the south wall. The yard was bare dirt and pine needles. The creek was audible in the dark, down the slope through the trees. Everything smelled of pine resin and cold soil and wood smoke from the banked fire he'd left. Evelyn stood in the yard and looked at it. He watched her looking at it, waiting for the moment when the full reality of what she'd agreed to landed on her. He'd seen it in men before, that particular kind of stillness right before a person decided they'd made a mistake. She turned to him. "Which trunk do you need first for the supply unloading?" He blinked. "What?" "Which should we unload first? Your supply crates or my trunks? I'm asking about sequence. The heavier items should go in last if we need to restack for winter storage." He stared at her. "Neither," he said. "We get the fire going and we eat something before we do anything else. It's dark and it's cold." "Of course." She turned and looked at the cabin door. "Do you have a key or does it just lift?" "Just lift." She walked to the door and lifted the latch and went inside. He stood in the yard for a moment with the mules and the dark mountains and the beginning of a wind coming off the peaks. He wasn't at all sure what he had brought home with him, but whatever it was, it hadn't broken yet, and he was beginning to understand that it might not. The first morning, Evelyn woke before the light, not because she was accustomed to it. In Boston, she had rarely risen before 7, and in St. Louis, she'd kept similar hours, but because the cold woke her. A deep, penetrating cold that had worked its way through the wool blankets and the flannel and settled into her bones somewhere around 3 in the morning, and by 5 she was lying in the dark of the cabin's small loft with her eyes open, listening to the silence and accepting the fact that she was not going back to sleep. She lay still for a few minutes, taking stock. The loft was low-ceilinged, just enough room to sit upright if she was careful. Below her she could hear Gideon's even breathing from the main room where he slept on a rope-strung bed near the stove. The stove had burned down in the night. The cabin was cold enough that she could see her breath when she finally pulled herself upright and sat on the edge of the sleeping platform. She climbed down the ladder slowly, trying not to make noise, and stood in the gray pre-dawn of the main room. The stove was a cast-iron box, wide and practical, and she had watched Gideon load it twice the previous evening. She opened the door now and found a few coals still living at the bottom, buried in ash. She found the wood box beside it, found birch bark for tinder the way she'd seen him use it, and spent 4 minutes coaxing those coals back into something useful. The fire caught. She didn't celebrate. She just fed it carefully until it was stable, then closed the door and stood with her hands near the heat. "You didn't have to do that." She turned. Gideon was awake, lying on his back with one arm behind his head, watching her from across the room. "I was cold," she said. "And you were still sleeping." He sat up. He slept in his clothes, she'd noticed, trousers and a heavy wool shirt, which made a certain practical sense she hadn't considered before. "You got the coals going yourself." It wasn't complicated. He studied the stove with the expression of a man revising something. Then he swung his legs off the bed and stood. "Water," he said. "We'll need water. Creek's not frozen yet, but it will be by January. You should know where it is in the dark." That was how her education began. Not with lessons, not with patient instruction, but with a sequence of practical necessities delivered one after another with minimal ceremony. The creek was down the slope through about 60 yards of pine trees, following a path worn smooth by 15 years of his footsteps. In daylight, it was easy. She memorized the turns anyway, counting steps, noting the sound of it, the way the pitch of the trees changed before the bank. She carried water in the 2 buckets he showed her, one in each hand for balance, up the slope and into the cabin. It was heavier than it looked. Her shoulders burned by the 3rd trip. "You'll get used to it," Gideon said, and he wasn't being cruel. She understood that. He was simply stating a fact the way he stated most things, without decoration. "I know," she said, and picked up the buckets again. The days fell into a pattern shaped entirely by the mountain's demands. Fire first, always. It could never be allowed to go completely out on cold nights. and the wood consumed itself faster than she would have believed. Water second, then breakfast, which she took over by the end of the first week, not because he asked her to, but because she needed to be useful, and the cooking was something she could control while the other skills were still half learned. She made mistakes constantly. The first time she tried to cook on the cast iron stove, she misjudged the heat and scorched a pot of cornmeal so badly the smell filled the cabin for half a day. Gideon ate what was salvageable without comment, which was both generous and somehow harder to bear than if he'd complained. The second attempt was better. By the end of the second week, she was managing the stove's tempers with something approaching competence, learning that it ran hotter on the right side, that it needed feeding every 2 hours in the deep cold, that baking required covering the skillet with a second pan to trap heat. The cold, though. The cold was its own problem. It wasn't like winter in Boston, which was wet and gray and unpleasant, but still within the range of human civilization. Buildings with heating stoves on every floor, wool coats sufficient for the walk between indoors and a waiting carriage. This cold was a different category of thing. It came down off the peaks with intention, finding every gap in the cabin walls, every moment the door was open too long, every hour the fire ran low. On the fourth day, the temperature dropped sharply, and she went out to the woodpile for a load of logs wearing what she'd considered adequate clothing, and came back inside shaking hard enough that Gideon looked up from the harness he was mending and immediately stood. "How long were you out there?" 10 minutes. Her teeth were doing something she couldn't control. He pointed at the stove. "Stand there." He went to the trunk at the foot of his bed and produced a heavy wool blanket, the kind that weighed 4 pounds and smelled of cedar. He wrapped it around her shoulders without asking, without particular tenderness, efficiently, the way you'd manage a problem. "You need more layers. What do you have?" "I have—" She was still shaking. "I have 2 wool skirts and a heavy coat." He went to a wooden chest near the door and pulled out a man's shirt, thick gray wool, and what appeared to be a pair of heavy canvas trousers with wool lining. "These are too big, but they'll work under your skirt. Add them tomorrow." He paused. "You should have told me you were cold." "I didn't want to complain." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not impatience, not sympathy exactly. Something between the two. "On the mountain you tell me when you're cold, when you're hurt, when something's wrong. Silence about those things doesn't make you stronger up here. It just makes things more dangerous." He went back to his harness. "Understood?" "Understood," she said. She stood by the stove until the shaking stopped, and after that she wore the canvas trousers under her skirts every day without self-consciousness, because it was 11 miles to the nearest person, and dignity about clothing was a luxury that cost too much. Gideon was not a difficult man to live with, she discovered, but he was not an easy one either. He was precise about the things he was precise about, where tools were kept, the order of morning tasks, the way wood should be stacked to season properly, and flexible about almost nothing in that category. She found herself mapping these territories the way she mapped the path to the creek, noting where the ground was firm and where it wasn't. She didn't bump against his rules often, and when she did, she adjusted without making it a scene, because this was his home and she was new to it, and there would be time later, if there was a later, to negotiate how things worked. What surprised her was that he was watching her do all of this. She'd catch it sometimes. A glance held half a second too long, a slight change in his expression when she managed something she hadn't managed before. He never praised her directly, which she'd begun to suspect was not coldness, but simply how he was built. He showed it in other ways. The second week he came in from the woodpile and set an axe beside the door without comment, a different axe from the one he used, shorter handled, lighter weighted. "What's this for?" she asked. "Kindling," he said. "The big axe is too heavy for splitting the small pieces. That one's better weighted for it." She picked it up, tested the weight. It fit her grip better than she'd expected. "You made this?" "Had it, haven't used it." He went back outside. She stood holding the axe and understood that he had, in his way, just given her something. The wood splitting did not go well initially. The technique was completely different from what her arms expected. Not strength, he explained one evening when she asked, but rotation. Letting the weight of the blade do the work at the right moment, the way a door swings easiest when you use the hinge correctly rather than forcing it. She practiced on a clear afternoon when he was checking his supply routes, splitting the same log 4 times until she could feel when she'd gotten the swing right versus when she was fighting herself. And by the end of that session, her palms were blistered and one wrist was complaining loudly, but she'd split enough kindling for 2 days. She didn't tell him about the blisters. She wrapped them that evening with a strip of clean cloth from her medical kit while he was outside banking the animals, and the next day she wore thin inner gloves under the work gloves and kept splitting. The days grew shorter in a way that felt almost violent. One afternoon she realized the light was failing at 3:30, and the next week it was going by 3, and the darkness was very dark up here, without street lamps or neighbors' windows. Only the stove glow and the oil lamp, and occasionally a sky so packed with stars it seemed like some kind of mathematical excess. She began to learn his rhythms. He rose early and moved through the morning tasks with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done them 10,000 times. He ate without much ceremony. He worked until the light failed, came in, ate again, read for an hour from one of the dozen books on a small shelf near his bed, worn spines, cracked covers, and slept. He didn't talk much in the evenings, but he wasn't closed off exactly. When she asked questions, he answered them fully. When she said something that caught his attention, she could see it register, a pause, a small realignment. One evening in the 3rd week, she asked, while they were eating, "How do you know which passes will close first?" He looked up. "Which passes?" "For your supply routes. You said you know them better than anyone. How do you read it?" He was quiet for a moment, and she expected him to deflect. Instead, he set down his fork and said, "Weather comes from the northwest here. The high passes face northwest, so they catch the first storms. But there are 2 mid-range passes that run northeast, and they stay open 2, sometimes 3 weeks longer because the ridgeline blocks the wind loading the snow on them." He picked up his fork. "Takes a few winters to learn which features do what. The mountain has patterns, but they're not regular." "Like a patient," she said without thinking. He looked at her. "What?" "Nothing, just—" She considered whether to explain it. "Patterns that aren't regular still have logic. You learn the underlying system, and then the variations make more sense." He watched her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like that." She went back to eating. He did too, but something in the air between them had shifted a small degree, the way a joint settles into correct alignment without drama. The hardest thing, she found, was not the cold or the labor or the isolation. The hardest thing was the accumulated uncertainty of her own limitations. There was no way to know, in advance, which task would defeat her. She couldn't predict that hauling water would be manageable, but that her first attempt at banking the fire in the pre-dawn would fail twice before she got it right, or that she would misjudge the weight of a full water bucket descending the icy creek path on the first cold morning and go down hard on her hip on the frozen ground with water pouring over her and 5 yards of slope still to manage. She lay there for a moment in the wet cold while her hip announced its unhappiness clearly, and she allowed herself exactly that long, lying in the frozen mud with water soaking through her coat, before she got up, picked up the bucket with what was left in it, and finished the climb. Gideon was at the woodpile when she came back, and he saw the wet coat immediately. He started toward her. "I slipped," she said. "I'm not hurt." He looked at her coat, at her face, at the bucket with its reduced water. "Hip or knee?" She blinked. "How did you—" "That's where people go down on that path. Ice forms just before the last turn." "Hip," she said. "It's fine." He stood there a moment. "Next time, use the stick." She hadn't noticed a stick. She hadn't known to look for one. "What stick?" He pointed at a wooden staff leaning against the creekside corner of the cabin that she had walked past 30 times without registering. He said nothing else, just went back to the woodpile, and she felt something in her chest that was approximately equal parts gratitude and exasperation. He could have told her about the stick weeks ago, but she understood slowly that this was also how he operated. He let her attempt things and fail at them first, and told her about the stick when she'd already learned why the stick existed. It was not cruelty. It was how he'd learned everything he knew, the hard way up a mountain, and it hadn't occurred to him that there was another method. She started using the stick. November arrived, and with it the first real snow, not the dustings they'd had in late October, but actual accumulation, 8 inches overnight, and more coming. She woke to a cabin that was seriously cold, despite the banked fire, dressed in every layer she owned before climbing down the ladder, and spent 20 minutes getting the stove properly going before the temperature in the main room climbed back to bearable. Gideon came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots, and said, "Good, you've got it going. It took longer than it should have. Cold affects the draft. Takes more to start it when it's this far below zero." "How far below?" He looked at the thermometer nailed to the doorframe outside, visible through the window. "About 12. 12 below zero." She processed that. "Is this typical for November?" "Early. Usually December before it's this cold." He hung up his coat. "Storm's gonna run a few days. We don't need to go out except for wood and water." "I'll get the water now then," she said. He turned to look at her. She was already buttoning her outer coat, had already pulled on the canvas trousers, was reaching for the heavy gloves. "The path will be slick under the new snow," he said. "I have the stick." Something moved through his expression so quickly she almost missed it. Not quite a smile, more the suggestion of one, the shape a smile might leave behind. "All right," he said. She went out into the white world with the 2 buckets and the stick, and she navigated the snow-covered path to the creek by feel and memory and the position of the trees, and she came back with full buckets and cold burned cheeks and the particular satisfaction of having done something the mountain tried to prevent. She set the buckets on the cabin floor. Gideon was at the stove. He handed her a mug of coffee without being asked. Hot, black, too strong. She wrapped both hands around it and said nothing, and neither did he. And the storm built quietly outside the log walls, and the fire held. There were still so many things she hadn't told him. The trunks sat against the wall where they'd stacked them the first night, and every time his eyes moved over them, she felt the weight of everything locked inside. The instruments, the medicines, the years of carefully documented practice, and underneath all of it, the reason she was here instead of in a city. The reason she had answered a mail-order advertisement with the desperation of someone who'd run as far as a train could carry her and needed to run just a little further still. She drank her coffee and watched the snow come down past the window and kept those things where they were, for now. The mountain had enough to teach her without adding that to it yet. December arrived the way all serious things arrive, quietly, without announcement, and with complete intention. The snow that had started in November never fully stopped. It paused sometimes, gave them a day or two of hard blue sky and brutal cold, then resumed as if it had only stepped away to gather more. The woodpile shrank faster than Evelyn had calculated, which meant Gideon spent more hours at the timber stand 200 yards up the slope, working the 2-man crosscut saw alone, because the saw required 2 people and he hadn't yet taught her how to work the other end without getting hurt. She'd asked twice. Both times he'd said he would show her when the footing was better, which she understood to mean he didn't want her near a falling tree on an icy slope, which was reasonable, which didn't stop her from asking a third time on a morning in early December when she watched him head up the slope alone with the saw over his shoulder and came to the slow boil of someone who was trying to be patient and running low on the supply. She didn't follow him. She split kindling instead, driving the small axe through the birch rounds with more force than strictly necessary. What she did, while he was up the slope, was spend the morning expanding what she could. She reorganized the root cellar, cataloging what they had against what they would need to last until the passes opened in spring. Late March at earliest, he'd said, and that was optimistic. She recounted the flour, the salt pork, the dried beans, the root vegetables she'd helped him store in October. She found a partial sack of cornmeal behind a crate that she hadn't known was there, which was a small relief. She made notes in the back pages of a journal she'd started keeping, the same journal where she tracked the weather, the firewood consumption, the creek's daily status. Data. It was the only way she knew to feel in control of something she couldn't fully control. Gideon came in at midday with sawdust on his coat and a shallow cut on the back of his left hand where a branch had caught him coming down. "Let me look at that," she said. "It's nothing." "Let me look at it anyway." He held out his hand with the expression of a man submitting to something unnecessary. She examined the cut. Not deep, clean edges, no debris. and cleaned it with a small amount of carbolic solution from the medicine chest she kept in one of her trunks, then wrapped it with a strip of clean linen. He watched her work. "You keep medical supplies in those trunks." "Yes." "That's what's in them." She looked up. "Mostly." He didn't push it. He pulled his hand back, tested the wrap, found it acceptable. She understood she had given him a piece of information, and he was turning it over somewhere in the back of his mind, not urgently, but it was there now. They ate in the usual near silence. Outside, the wind was building. She could feel it in the walls, the way the cabin breathed differently under high wind. A low, almost subsonic pressure that she'd learned to read as a storm indicator more reliable than the thermometer. "Wind's picking up," she said. He nodded. "Tonight. Should we check the animals?" "I'll go at dusk." He paused. "You can come if you want. Learn where things are in the dark." It was the closest he'd come to volunteering her into a task rather than waiting for her to insert herself, and she recognized it as something, though she wasn't sure exactly what. "All right," she said. So that evening they checked the small stable together. 2 mules, the horse he used for lighter trail work, in wind that was cold enough to make her eyes water immediately on stepping out the door. She held the lantern while he checked the animals' water, their feed, the stability of the stable walls against the gusting. She noted the way he moved among the animals, not with affection exactly, but with a kind of steady attentiveness, checking each one the way you'd check a set of instruments you depended on. "The gray one favors her left front leg when it's this cold," he said, running a hand down the mule's leg without looking up. "Doesn't mean anything's wrong, just an old strain, but watch for it." "How long have you had her?" 9 years. "You named her?" A pause that was almost sheepish. "Clara." Evelyn looked at the mule. Clara gazed back with the profound indifference only mules could manage. "And the other one?" "May." "And the horse?" "That's just the horse." She laughed. It came out before she'd decided to, and it surprised both of them. It was the first time she had laughed, she realized, since stepping off the stagecoach in Ash Hollow. Maybe longer. Gideon looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Unguarded, slightly startled, as if a door had opened somewhere he hadn't expected one. "Well," she said, composing herself. "Hello, Clara." They went back inside. The storm hit fully around 9 that night and ran for 2 days. And those 2 days were the strangest and in some ways the most revealing stretch of time they had yet spent together. Confined to the cabin, no outside work possible except the necessary runs to the stable and woodpile, they existed in close proximity without the buffer of tasks that kept them separate. She read. He worked on equipment, harness repair, blade sharpening, the painstaking work of maintaining things so they didn't fail when failure was expensive. She found herself watching him work sometimes, the way his hands moved over familiar objects, with a competence so deep it had become invisible to him. On the second storm night, he did something unexpected. He got up from his equipment work and pulled a book from the shelf and set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. Plant identification, Western mountain species, annotated heavily in the margins in his square handwriting. "You catalog things," he said, "patterns, the way you did with the food stores." He sat back down. "That might be useful in spring, knowing what grows here and what's edible." She looked at the book, at the annotations. He had been thorough. He had pressed samples between pages, labeled them, noted seasonal timing, elevation ranges. It was the work of someone who paid extremely close attention to the world around them and wrote it down because writing things down was how you made knowledge reliable. She recognized that impulse completely. "You should have been a scientist," she said. He picked up a harness buckle and examined it. "I am one," he said simply. "Just not the kind with a certificate." She opened the book and started reading. 3 weeks into December, the rhythm they'd found was functional, if not warm. They managed the cabin together without significant friction. She cooked. He hauled the heavy loads, and the middle ground, water, firewood, animal care, they split without formal negotiation. He had stopped waiting for her to fail at things, which felt like a larger shift than it should have. What he still didn't know was why she was here. She felt the weight of it sometimes in the evenings, when the lamp threw its small circle of light, and the fire made its sounds, and the two of them existed in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable but was still, in some essential way, incomplete. She had told him almost nothing real about herself. He hadn't pushed. She was aware that his restraint on that front was its own form of consideration. He didn't pry, he waited, he let her be whoever she needed to be while she got her footing. And that made the withholding feel heavier rather than lighter. She was still working out how much to say and when, which was when the decision got made for her. The morning of December 19th, Gideon went up the slope to cut timber. She was at the woodpile splitting kindling when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong, a cracking report like a rifle shot but wrong, too sustained, followed immediately by a heavy impact that she felt through the soles of her boots, and then a sound she had no reference point for. Something between a shout and something that wasn't a shout at all, cut off too quickly. She dropped the axe and ran. The slope was steep and slick, and she went down on one knee 20 yards up and got back up without stopping, grabbing pine branches to pull herself along, following his boot prints in the snow toward the timber stand. She heard him before she saw him. A low, controlled sound that she recognized with the part of her brain that had spent years in places where people made sounds like that, trying to manage pain without wasting energy on noise. She found him at the base of a large fir. The tree had come down wrong. A hinge failure, she'd learn later. The cut hadn't run true, and the trunk had kicked back instead of falling forward, and it had caught him on the way down. He was on the ground with his back against a boulder, and his right leg was extended wrongly, bleeding through his trouser leg from a gash she could see even from 10 feet away, and his right shoulder sat at an angle that made her stomach drop because she knew exactly what that angle meant. He looked up when he heard her. His face was gray and set. "How bad?" he said. Not a question, a demand for information. She was already moving toward him, already dropping to her knees in the snow beside him, her hands going first to his face, color, pupils, coherence, and then to the shoulder, not touching yet, just reading the position. Shoulders dislocated, anterior probably. I can see the deformity. Her hands moved to his leg, found the trouser leg, pulled the fabric back from the wound. Deep, ragged edges. The muscle beneath was torn, but she couldn't see bone, which mattered. Leg is bleeding heavily, but I don't think it's arterial. The blood isn't pulsing. "How do you know that?" he said, and his voice was tight with pain control, but his eyes were sharp, still sharp, watching her. "Because I know what arterial bleeding looks like." She pressed her hand hard against the wound, and he made a sound through clenched teeth. "I need to get you to the cabin. Can you walk on this leg?" "No." "Then we need to do this differently." She looked back down the slope, calculating. 60 yards of steep, icy terrain between here and the cabin door. Him unable to bear weight on the injured leg and the shoulder useless for a crutch on that side. "I'm going to make you a support. I need 2 minutes. Evelyn?" She looked at him. "What are you?" he said. She held his gaze for 1 second. "I'll explain inside. Hold this." She took his left hand and pressed it against the wound over hers. Pressure. Don't lift it. She went to the timber stand and found 2 straight-cut branches from his morning's work, each about 5 feet long. She pulled the linen underskirt she wore beneath her wool skirt, the one she'd added for warmth 2 weeks ago, and tore it into strips with her hands and her teeth, working fast while her mind ran the problem ahead of her. She came back and built a crude but functional splint brace for his leg, enough to provide stability for the trip down, binding it tightly while he watched her face with an expression she couldn't read because she wasn't looking at his face, she was looking at her work. "This is going to hurt," she said. "The walk down. I can't prevent that." "I know." He paused. "I can manage it." "I know you can." She looked at him then. "On 3, we're going to get you up on the left leg. You lean into me on the right side, not the shoulder, the chest, and we go slow." It took them 25 minutes to cover 60 yards, and she would not remember most of it in detail later. What she would remember was the sound of his breathing, steady and controlled in a way that cost him enormously, and the weight of him against her side, and the way she talked him through each section of slope without quite knowing she was doing it. 4 more steps, then we rest on that tree. 3 more steps now. Here's the flat section. Almost. Not soothing exactly, just precise and continuous, because silence would have let the pain in, and she needed his attention on the next step. They got through the cabin door. She put him on his bed. He made no sound at all when she moved the shoulder to lay him flat, which told her how far past ordinary endurance he already was. "I have to get my things," she said. "I'll be 30 seconds. "Evelyn." His voice stopped her at the trunks. She looked back. He was lying on the bed, gray-faced, jaw set, watching her. "Whatever's in those trunks, use it." She opened both trunks. The first thing Gideon saw from across the room was the instrument roll. Dark leather, unrolling to reveal a set of surgical tools that had no business existing in a mountain cabin, arranged with the precision of long practice. Forceps, probes, a bone-handled scalpel in 3 sizes, curved needles already threaded with silk suture on a small card, a bone saw she prayed she wouldn't need. Then the medicine case, brown glass bottles in fitted slots, each labeled in her small, precise hand. Carbolic acid, laudanum, chloroform in a sealed tin, compound tincture of opium, silver nitrate for wound sealing, and beneath all of it, in a fitted wooden case, a medical text in her own handwriting, not printed. Written. 400 pages of practice, case studies, surgical techniques, annotated and indexed. 10 years of knowledge made portable. He said nothing. He watched her set up her workspace at the table beside his bed with the attention of a man trying to understand something that had just changed all his existing assumptions. "The leg first," she said, more to herself than him. "Suture the muscle, close the wound, then the shoulder." "You've sutured muscle before." "Yes." "Where?" "Boston and elsewhere." She was boiling water, getting her carbolic solution ready, unrolling the instrument case. "I practiced medicine for 6 years." The pause before he spoke was exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. "You're a doctor." "I was trained as one. Women can't be licensed in most states." She looked at him directly. "I practiced anyway." He absorbed this. His color was still bad and the pain was in his eyes, even if it wasn't in his voice. "Is that why you left?" "Not entirely." She pulled up the chair. "I'm going to clean this wound now, and it's going to hurt considerably. I have laudanum, if you want it." "No." "The wound cleaning, yes, but the shoulder, I have to get you relaxed enough that the muscles will release. That requires something." He looked at the bottles. "Chloroform?" "A small amount. Enough to take the edge off without putting you under. I need you conscious to tell me what you feel." "You've done this before," he said. Not a question anymore. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had hauled water and split kindling and learned to bank a fire in 30 below zero, and who now sat beside his bed with surgical instruments laid out on a clean cloth, with the calm of someone who had done this so many times it lived in her hands. "All right," he said. She worked for 2 hours. The wound cleaning was exactly as bad as she told him it would be, and he endured it with a stillness that was almost inhuman. She found herself talking again, not soothing, but explaining, telling him each step before she did it, what she was looking for, what she found, because his whole character was built around information, and she understood by now that information was how he managed things beyond his control. The muscle tear was deep, and she had to work layer by layer, irrigating between each pass, making sure there was no debris she'd missed. Traction and rotation, the exact angle, and the patience to wait for the muscle to yield rather than forcing it. She felt the moment it happened, the joint dropping back into the socket with a definitive thunk that made him inhale sharply and then exhale with something that was close to relief. "Stay still," she said. "I'm still." "Your whole body, not just your arm." He made himself still. She sat back. Her lower back ached. Her hands were starting the shaking she'd been holding off for 2 hours. She pressed them flat against her thighs for a moment, hidden under the edge of the table, and let them shake until they were done. Then she checked his pulse, his color, his pupil response. Better. Not good yet, but better. "You're going to need a week at minimum before that shoulder bears any load," she said. "The leg will take longer. 3 weeks before you can put real weight on it." He was looking at the ceiling. 3 weeks, he said flatly. "The muscle needs time to heal properly, or it will tear again at the first real strain. That's not a suggestion. I have to cut timber. No, she said. You don't. Not for 3 weeks. She met his eyes when he turned his head to look at her. I'll do it. You can't cut timber alone. You'll teach me the two-man saw technique while you're lying there. She said it evenly, or I'll work the single blade, either way. He stared at her. Stop looking at me like that, she said. You looked at me the same way in Ash Hollow, and you were wrong then, too. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not quite, the shape of one. You were a doctor, he said, like he was still fitting it into the frame of everything else he knew about her. In Boston, among other places. And you came to the frontier. I did. Why? She gathered her instruments, beginning to clean them one by one in the carbolic solution, her hands moving through the familiar sequence. The fire was low. She'd need to feed it. Outside, the wind was picking up again. The light through the window was already going gray, though it was barely past midday, the short December light vanishing before you could use it. Someone wanted to use me, she said, the way you'd use a tool. He had the kind of power that makes wanting something the same as having it. She set down a cleaned forceps and picked up the next. I left before he could. Gideon was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. The fire needed feeding, and she got up to do it, adding 2 logs and adjusting the damper, then came back and finished cleaning the instruments and rolled them back into their leather case with the careful movements of long habit. Is he looking for you? Gideon asked. She tucked the instrument roll back into the trunk. Probably. Another long silence. The fire took hold of the new logs, and the light in the room shifted warmer. Evelyn? She looked at him. He was lying on his back, shoulder immobilized, leg wrapped, face still pale, but his eyes clear and steady on hers. Gideon Thorne, who had looked at her stepping off a stagecoach and almost walked away, who had handed her a lighter axe without acknowledging it was a gift, who called his mule Clara and named the horse Nothing, who read plant identification books with the thoroughness of a scientist and never once told her she'd done well even when she had. Nobody's taking you off this mountain, he said. He said it the same way he said everything, without decoration, without performing it, just a fact he was stating, the way he stated facts about weather patterns and past closures, as if it were simply true and therefore required no further discussion. She looked at him for a moment. This man she had married as an act of desperation and was only now beginning actually to know. Rest, she said. I'll check the wound in 2 hours. She turned back to her trunks and began the methodical task of restoring everything to its proper place, her hands moving through the familiar order, the mountain dark and cold and sealed around the small, warm fact of the cabin, the fire holding, the 2 of them inside it with everything finally, irrevocably known. She checked his wound at 2 hours, then again at 4, then again in the middle of the night when she woke to the sound of him shifting on the bed and knew from the quality of the silence that followed he was in more pain than he was going to say. She got up without being asked. I'm fine, he said from the dark. You're not. She lit the lamp, turned it low, and came to his bedside. She checked the wound dressing, some seepage, which was normal, the edges holding. She checked the shoulder, which was swollen and radiating heat in the way joints did when they were angry about what had happened to them. She got the laudanum from the trunk. Half a dose, she said, for the night. I don't want to be foggy. It's 3 a.m. You don't need to be sharp. You need to sleep so your body can do the work. She poured it, measured it with the same precision she measured everything. You can be stubborn about this tomorrow. A pause. Then he took the glass from her hand. She waited until he'd taken it and lay back down before she went to the stove and added wood, because the fire had dropped and the night cold was pressing hard against the cabin walls. When she came back, he was already going drowsy, the laudanum moving fast on an exhausted system, and he said something she almost didn't catch, low, a little blurred at the edges. You're good at this, he said. She stood for a moment beside his bed in the lamplight. Sleep, she said. She sat in the chair by the stove for a while after, not trying to sleep, listening to his breathing even out. Outside, the wind had settled. The mountain was quiet in the particular way it went quiet under deep cold. a silence so complete it had texture, like the inside of something sealed. She thought about Boston. She tried not to most nights, but the laudanum and the lamplight and the quality of the quiet made her defenses thin, and it came anyway. His name was Harlan Crest, not a name that meant anything outside of certain circles in certain northeastern cities, but inside those circles it meant everything. Money, political reach, the kind of influence that didn't need to announce itself because it was simply present in every room he entered. She had first come to his attention through her work in the Dorchester Clinic, a charitable operation treating the city's poor, where she'd spent 3 years doing the work no licensed physician wanted to do. Crest had not cared about the clinic. He'd cared about her specifically. A physician of genuine skill operating entirely outside official channels, which meant entirely outside the protections official channels provided. He'd made his proposition with complete courtesy, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't. He wanted a private physician, exclusive. Available at his direction for purposes he left carefully unspecified, which was its own kind of specification. She had understood within the first 10 minutes of that conversation what she was really being asked to do, and what would happen if she declined, and she had declined anyway, and what followed over the next 4 months was a systematic and patient campaign to make her position in Boston untenable, professional, social, eventually physical, until the choice reduced itself to leave or be taken. She had left. St. Louis was supposed to be far enough. It wasn't far enough. 3 years there and his reach arrived anyway, quiet and preliminary, feeling out the ground before the demand followed. So she had looked at a map and found the farthest point her money could move her, and answered the advertisement in the back of a newspaper that she had barely read, and sent her letter to Gideon Thorne of the Colorado Territory Mountains, and packed her trunks and run. She had not told him any of this that evening, after the surgery. She had given him the shape of it, someone who wanted to use her, power, that made wanting the same as having, the flight. But not the name, not the reach, not the fact that Harlan Crest was not the kind of man who accepted a closed door and found another way in. He was the kind of man who removed the door. She sat by the stove with this, turning it over, aware that she had been keeping it locked behind a wall for 2 months, and equally aware that the wall had just developed a serious crack. Because something had changed in this cabin this evening, and she was honest enough with herself, alone at 3 a.m, to acknowledge what it was. He had looked at her from that bed, shoulder wrecked and leg torn open, and said nobody was taking her off this mountain, and he had said it the same way he said things he was certain of, the way he said which pass would close first and what the temperature was, and how long the leg needed to heal. She was not accustomed to that. She was not entirely sure what to do with it. The next 3 weeks were the strangest she had ever lived, and she had lived through some strange stretches of time. She ran the cabin alone. All of it. Not because she was trying to prove something anymore. That phase had passed. But because there was simply no one else to do it, and it needed doing. She was up before light every morning, banking the fire and melting snow for water since the creek had frozen solid in a cold snap 3 days after the accident. She fed the animals and checked Clara's left front leg, and carried wood and cooked and cleaned and managed the medicine that kept Gideon's wound from going bad, which required monitoring and daily dressing changes and the vigilance of someone who understood infection and what it looked like in its early stages. The 3rd day after the accident, she found the wound site slightly warmer than it should be and spent an hour cleaning it out with carbolic solution while Gideon sat with his jaw clenched and his eyes on the wall. And by the end of that hour, she was fairly sure she'd caught it before it deepened. And the next morning the warmth was gone, which was one of the better things she had felt in some time. She started cutting timber on the 4th day. He watched her from the cabin window the first time. She could feel it, as she climbed the slope with the single-blade felling axe and spent the morning on a stand of dead birch he'd marked earlier in the fall. Dead birch was easier than green timber, he'd told her from his bed, walking her through it with the thoroughness he brought to all mechanical knowledge. Score the fall direction first, cut the notch, hinge your cut from the back, get clear. She worked through the sequence, made the mistakes he'd predicted she'd make, corrected them, and got the first tree down by noon in roughly the right direction. It fell 20 degrees off her intended line and clipped a pine branch on the way down that she hadn't cleared, and the impact threw a spray of bark and snow that knocked her backward into a drift. She lay in the drift for a moment, looking at the sky. Then she got up and started on the second tree. By the end of the week, she could fell a birch with reasonable predictability. By the end of 2 weeks, she was getting the wood into lengths he could split one-handed from a seated position outside the cabin door, which he started doing on day 12, despite her telling him to wait until day 14 and him informing her, with a flatness that wasn't quite defiance but was adjacent to it, that he was sitting outside and it was a single-handed operation and his leg wasn't involved. "The shoulder is involved," she said. "The left shoulder. The exertion transfers. I'll stop if it pulls." She stood in front of him with her arms crossed, and he looked up at her from the chopping block with that expression he got when he was going to do what he intended to do, regardless of input. 20 minutes, she said. "Then you stop whether it pulls or not. And if that wound reopens, I will tell you nothing about treating it except that you deserve it." "That's not very medical of you." 20 minutes. He split wood for exactly 22 minutes and then went inside without being told to. She chose not to note the 2 extra minutes. He was healing faster than she'd projected, actually. He ate well and slept well and had the kind of baseline physical condition that meant the body's repair systems had good material to work with. But fast healing was relative, and she was not going to let him undo 3 weeks of careful work because he was restless. During the long hours of his recovery, they talked more than they had in the previous 2 months combined. It emerged in layers, the way it does when 2 people are in a small space with long evenings and finally pass the stage of performing for each other. He told her about the 15 winters and why he'd chosen this kind of life. Not running from something, which was what she'd assumed, but running toward something, though he didn't call it that. He said he'd grown up in Illinois on a farm that felt like a slow suffocation, too many people and not enough space, and the feeling that the world as given to him was the wrong size. He'd come west at 19 and gone high into the mountains on his first winter supply run, and something had released in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched, and he'd never gone back east for anything more than trade. "You wanted to be alone," she said. "I wanted enough space that being alone was a choice, not just a condition." He thought about it. There's a difference. She understood that distinction more than she wanted to admit. She told him more in return. Not about Crest yet. She was still circling that, still finding the words. But about the work, which was easier to talk about than the reason she'd left it. She told him about the Dorchester Clinic, about the particular satisfaction of being useful in the precise way you were built to be useful, about the patients who came in expecting nothing because the city had trained them to expect nothing, and the way she could sometimes change that in a single appointment. She told him about teaching herself anatomy from a medical school textbook she'd obtained through a physician who understood what she was doing and chose to help her, and the years of practice that followed, and the things you learned from practice that no textbook could convey. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without performing interest, but with absolute actual interest, which was better. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The clinic." She thought about it honestly. "I miss the work," she said. "I don't miss the city. I never quite fit there." "Where did you fit?" She looked around the cabin, the log walls, the low ceiling, the 2 trunks against the wall, the window showing nothing but dark mountain and stars. "I'm still finding out," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then looked at the fire and said nothing, and she understood that he heard more in that answer than she'd meant to give. Christmas came and went without ceremony. She made a better meal than usual, dried apple pie in the Dutch oven, a small extravagance of sugar and spice, and Gideon produced from somewhere a small bottle of rye whiskey that he poured into 2 tin cups in quantities that suggested it was being treated as a mark of occasion rather than a habit. They sat by the fire and ate the pie and drank the whiskey, and outside the mountain was dark and cold and deeply indifferent to the date. "You don't celebrate," she said. "Not much to celebrate alone." She turned her cup in her hands. "Not alone this year." He looked at her. "No," he said. "Not this year." It was not a romantic moment in any conventional sense. He was still moving carefully with the shoulder, and his leg was still wrapped, and they were both tired in the particular deep way of people who have been managing something hard for several weeks without rest. But it was true, and it was theirs, and she found, to her own surprise, that it was enough. The rest of December passed and January arrived, and he was back on his feet, fully functional, moving with only the slight compensation of a man who knew where the healing was still new. The wound had closed cleanly. The shoulder had regained its range. She watched him carry a full load of wood without favoring either side, and felt something settle in her chest that was satisfaction of a specific and complicated kind. Not pride exactly, but close to it. She had done that. She had kept him alive and kept the cabin running and cut timber alone for 3 weeks, and had not once, not for a single morning, considered that she couldn't. She thought about this one afternoon in early January while she was at the creek with her ice pick and her buckets, opening the hole she kept cut through the ice for the daily water. The cold was about 15 below, comfortable now in a way that would have seemed insane to her in October. She worked the ice pick with the automatic efficiency of something she'd done 200 times, listened to the mountain silence, and allowed herself a thought she'd been keeping at a careful distance. She was not hiding here anymore. Or rather, she had come here hiding, but somewhere in the last 3 months, hiding had turned into something else, something that felt with increasing insistence like arriving. She was carrying the full buckets back up the slope when she saw the tracks, not animal tracks, boot prints. Coming from the lower trail, wide-spaced and heavy, the prints of a large man or 2 men moving together, overlapping. She stopped in the snow and looked at them and felt the bottom of her stomach go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She went inside. Gideon was at the table cleaning his rifle, and he looked up at her face before she said a word. "What?" "Tracks," she said, "on the lower trail, coming up." He set down the rifle cloth. "How many?" "I couldn't tell. 2, maybe 3. The prints overlapped." He stood and went to the window, looking down the slope. "Coming up that trail in January means they left the valley 3 or 4 days ago in that storm." He turned from the window. "They didn't come up here by accident." She put down the water buckets. Her hands were steady, she noted distantly, the same way they were steady during the surgery. Fear collected in her, but it went somewhere useful, sharpened her thinking rather than scattered it. "It's too soon," she said. "The passes should be closed. There's one route that stays open longer. I know it. A few others do too." He was already moving, pulling his coat from the peg. "If someone paid enough to find out—" "Harlan Crest," she said. He stopped moving and looked at her. She had never said the name before. "That's who," she said. "His name is Harlan Crest. He's a political figure out of Boston, but his reach is considerably wider than that. He has money, and he has men who do what money buys, and I knew when I left that I hadn't gone far enough, but I had run out of far enough to go." She looked at Gideon. "He's very patient. He doesn't stop." Gideon was quiet for 3 seconds. She watched him process this, not in fear, not in calculation of his own safety, but with the look he got when he was reading a terrain problem and working out the solution. "How many men would he send?" he said. "At least 2, probably 3. He doesn't underestimate." "Neither do I." He took his rifle down from the wall mount. He checked the load with the automatic habit of someone for whom this was simply part of the process, not a dramatic gesture. "There are 2 ways up to this cabin from the lower trail, the obvious route and a high traverse that comes in from the north. They'll know the obvious one." He began moving toward the door. "Stay inside. Keep the fire. If you hear me fire twice, I'm not staying inside." He stopped with his hand on the door. "If there are 3 of them and 1 of you," she said, "you need to know you have someone behind you, not someone you're worrying about inside a cabin." "Evelyn." "I have a rifle too." She moved past him to the wall where the second rifle hung, the lighter point .44 caliber that he'd showed her the basics of in the first week when he'd told her flatly that a woman alone in a mountain cabin needed to know how to shoot, and she'd agreed without argument. She took it down. "I'm not a good shot yet, but at close range I'm adequate." He looked at her holding the rifle with the same expression he'd had in Ash Hollow, that recalibration, that having to revise what he assumed, and she looked back at him with a patience she'd earned over 3 months of exceeding what he expected. "You stay high," he said finally, "north corner of the stable. There's a good sight line to the approach. You don't move from that position unless I tell you to." "Understood." "And you don't fire unless I've fired first or someone's inside 10 yards. "Also understood." He looked at her a moment longer, This woman who had come off a stagecoach in silk gloves and was now holding a rifle with cold, steady hands in a mountain cabin in January, preparing to help protect the life she'd made here. "You know," he said, "I almost left you standing in that street in Ash Hollow." "I know," she said. "You were wrong to consider it." Something happened in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, and might have been both at once. The expression of a man who understands a thing too late, but is grateful to understand it at all. "Come on, then," he said, and opened the door, and they went out together into the white and frozen world. They waited 2 hours in the cold, she at the stable's north corner, and he positioned at the tree line covering the approach, neither moving, neither speaking, the mountain holding its breath around them. And then the tracks below told their story. Whoever had started up the trail had stopped, turned back, maybe spooked by the sign of an occupied and alert homestead, maybe stopped by the cold, maybe by the sudden pragmatic arithmetic of 3 men looking up a defended slope and deciding the job wasn't worth the cost. They came back inside at dusk, cold through but unshot. Evelyn stood by the stove, warming her hands, and Gideon stood at the window, watching the last of the light. "They'll be back," she said. "Maybe." He turned from the window. "Or maybe they'll send word back that the mountain's not worth it, and Crest will find a different solution." He met her eyes. "Either way, we'll be ready." She nodded. She believed him, and understanding why she believed him took her a moment. Not because he'd said the right words, but because in 3 months of watching how he handled what the mountain brought at him, she had not once seen him fail to find a way through. Not the cliff trail, not the timber accident, not the 3 weeks he'd spent healing while she managed everything and checked his wound every 2 hours in the night. He was not a man who gave up on things he'd decided to keep. She had, she realized, somewhere between the frozen creek and the timber stand and the nights beside his bed, taking his pulse in the dark, become one of those things. "Dinner," she said. "I'll start it. I'll help." She looked at him. He had never offered before. "You don't cook." "No," he agreed, "but I can chop things, if you tell me what needs chopping." She looked at him for another moment. Then she went to the supply shelf and handed him an onion and a knife, and he stood at the table beside her, and they worked in the warmth of the stove, and the storm built again outside, slowly, wrapping the mountain in snow, and the cabin held against it the way it had held against every storm before, because it was built to last, and the people inside it, she was beginning to understand, were too. The men came back in February. Not the same men, or maybe they were, she couldn't know that, but 3 figures on horseback appeared at the lower edge of the slope on a gray morning when the temperature had climbed briefly to something almost bearable, and the snow had packed hard enough to hold a horse's weight without breaking through. Gideon saw them first from the timber stand where he'd gone back to cutting, fully recovered now, the shoulder moving clean and the leg carrying its full load. He came down the slope at a controlled pace that she recognized as the gait of a man who didn't want to alarm but was also not wasting time. "3 riders," he said, coming through the door. "They stopped at the tree line. They're looking at the cabin." She was at the stove. She didn't drop what she was doing, just moved it off the heat and turned around. "Armed?" Couldn't see clearly. Probably. She went to the trunk. Not the instrument trunk. The other one, the deeper one. The one whose bottom layer she'd never shown him. She lifted out the medical texts and the supply cases and found what was underneath. A leather document wallet, thick with paper, tied with 2 straps. She set it on the table. Gideon looked at it. "What's that?" "Insurance," she said. "Sit down. I need to tell you the rest of it." He sat. She had been rehearsing this, in a loose way, for weeks. Not the words exactly, but the shape of it, how to lay it out so it was a full picture and not just selected pieces. She talked for 20 minutes while outside the riders stayed at the tree line and didn't advance, and Gideon sat across the table from her and listened with the focused stillness he brought to things that mattered. Harlan Crest, she told him, was a state senator from Massachusetts with significant investments in several industries that operated in the gray space between legal and not. She had treated his workers, not at his direction purely through the clinic, and in doing so had accumulated across 3 years a particular kind of knowledge about the injuries those workers sustained. Injuries that told stories if you understood anatomy well enough to read them. Injuries consistent with specific kinds of industrial negligence that Crest spent considerable money keeping out of newspapers and courtrooms. She had documented everything, because documentation was what she did, the same way she documented weather and creek levels and food supplies, not with intent to use it, initially, just because she was a person who recorded what she observed and kept those records organized. When Crest came to her with his proposition and she'd declined and the campaign against her had begun, she had understood what those records were worth. Not as leverage, she was not built for leverage, didn't have the stomach for that kind of chess, but as protection. She had filed copies with 2 separate attorneys in 2 separate cities under sealed instructions, accessible only under specific conditions. A dead man's switch, effectively. If she disappeared or died under unclear circumstances, those documents became public. He knows about them? Gideon asked. He figured it out eventually, which is why I'm still alive. She paused. Can't use me if I'm dead and the documents get released. He can't get to the documents while I'm alive and keeping them sealed. So it's a standoff. But he keeps sending men to remind me that the standoff depends on my continued cooperation with the arrangement. The arrangement being that you stay hidden and keep your mouth shut. And he stays away. Yes. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document wallet on the table. What's in there? Copies, she said, of everything. Dates, injuries, names, 15 workers over 3 years with my clinical assessments. She looked at him. It's enough. It would be enough if it ever saw a proper hearing. But you can't take it to a hearing. I'm a woman who practiced medicine without a license. Any hearing that involved me would become about that, not about him. He knows it, and I know it. She folded her hands on the table. So we stay where we are? Gideon leaned back in his chair. He looked at the window, at the gray sky beyond it, at the tree line where she knew 3 riders were still sitting their horses and watching the cabin. What if, he said slowly, the documents didn't come from you? She looked at him. What do you mean? I move trade goods through 3 territories. I know every merchant, every freight agent, every newspaper editor between here and Denver. He brought his eyes back to hers. What if those documents arrived somewhere useful, with a different origin attached to them? Someone Crest can't trace back to you. She stared at him. You'd do that? I do considerably more than that, he said, and his voice had the same quality it had when he told her nobody was taking her off this mountain, flat and certain, and not particularly interested in discussion. She was quiet for a moment, working through it. It would take time, she said, finding the right path, making sure it couldn't come back to either of us. I have time, he said, and I know the paths. Outside, after another 10 minutes, the 3 riders turned their horses and went back the way they came. Maybe the defended posture of the homestead discouraged them again. Maybe they were only watching, reporting back. Maybe Crest was managing his options from a distance, keeping the pressure present without escalating. Whatever the reason, they left, and she watched them go from the window and felt the knot in her chest loosen by 1 degree, not fully, but enough to breathe through. They'll come back again, she said. I know. Gideon came to stand beside her at the window. But not forever. Men like that rely on the other person having nowhere to go, on them being more afraid of the fight than of whatever they're running from. He looked down at her. You have somewhere to go now. She didn't answer that directly. She wasn't sure she had the words for what she wanted to say, which was something about how she understood now that the most dangerous thing she'd done in the last several years was not fleeing Boston or spending a winter in a mountain cabin or even performing surgery on a floor with a lantern and her instrument roll. The most dangerous thing had been letting someone into the full picture of who she was and what she carried, and finding that it made her less frightened rather than more. Show me how the trade routes work, she said. I want to understand the options. He looked at her for a moment, and then he went to the shelf and took down his route maps, hand-drawn, annotated with seasonal notes in his square writing, and spread them on the table, and they sat together, and he began to explain. Spring came the way it always came to the high country, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual argument, the mountain conceding ground to warmth in pieces. First, the south-facing slopes went bare in late February, dark rock showing through the snow. Then the creek broke up in March, chunks of ice grinding past each other for a few days before the water ran clear. Then the passes began opening, first the northeast route in late March, as Gideon had predicted, and then the others through April. With the pass's opening came the first contact with the world below. A supply rider came up the northeast route in early April, the first outsider they had seen since October. His name was Decker, a young man who ran messages and small goods for the trading network Gideon was part of, and he arrived red-faced from the cold with a satchel of letters and trade updates and a cheerful willingness to eat whatever was offered to him. He ate 2 bowls of the venison stew Evelyn had made and talked with the uncorked energy of someone who'd been riding alone for 3 days, and she sat across the table from him and answered his questions about the winter carefully and watched Gideon pass him something, a folded document packet sealed with wax, with an address she didn't recognize, with the casual ease of one man handing another an ordinary piece of business. Decker tucked it in his satchel without looking at it. "Going to Reardon in Denver," he said, already talking about something else. "Can take anything headed that direction." "Just that," Gideon said. Decker nodded, ate more stew, told them about the valley below, about what had happened over the winter in the towns they'd left behind in October. He mentioned, with the gossipy ease of a man who'd collected the information along his route, that there had been some strangers through the valley in February, asking about routes up the mountain, asking about the homestead at the top. Nobody had told them much of anything, he said, because mountain people had a long tradition of not being helpful to strangers who came asking questions about neighbors. "I appreciate that," Gideon said. "Figured you might." Decker drank his coffee and didn't press it. After he left, she stood at the door watching his horse descend the trail until the trees took him, and she thought about the sealed packet now in his satchel and what it contained and where it was going and what would happen when it arrived. "Reardon," she said when she came back inside. "Who is he?" "A man who knows how to get things to the right people without the trail pointing back to where it started." Gideon was pulling on his work coat. "He's been doing that kind of work for 20 years. Good at it. You trust him, as much as I trust anyone I've dealt with for a decade and never been lied to." She nodded. It would take months, she knew. Crest was well defended and the path had to be careful. But careful was something she could do. She had been doing careful for a very long time. May brought warmth, real warmth, the kind that made the cabin feel stuffy for the first time since October. And they spent the first genuinely warm afternoon expanding the south-facing garden plot that Gideon had kept in a small way for years. She had looked at his plant identification book through the winter and come out the other side with specific opinions about what could grow at this elevation and what couldn't. And they negotiated this with the good-natured friction of 2 people who both had knowledge and were working out how to combine it without either one running the conversation. "The growing season is too short for corn," she said. "I know, I've tried. It doesn't finish. Potatoes would do better, and root vegetables generally. I want to try parsnips." "Parsnips," he said, in the tone of a man who was not opposed but hadn't considered it. "They store well, and the caloric value per square foot of garden is better than most alternatives." She looked at the plot. "If we double the size of this bed, we reduce how much we need to bring up from the valley by a third." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same plot. "The ground is harder on the north end. We'd have to break it." "I know. I factored that into the estimate." He looked at her sideways. "You factored it in." "I tend to do that." "I've noticed," he said, and for once it was warm rather than neutral, which she received without quite knowing what to do with it, which was still how those moments went sometimes, even after all this time. They broke the ground together over 2 days. It was hard work. The soil was rocky and still cold beneath the surface, and the pickaxe required both of them to make reasonable progress. She had blisters again by the end of the 2nd day, which she wrapped that evening while he was outside and said nothing about, because some habits died slowly. He saw them anyway. She caught him looking at her hands at dinner, and said nothing in return, which was also a habit of his, noting things without making them into observations that required response. The letter came in June. Decker again? Passing through on a longer route, with a different satchel and a letter at the bottom of it that he handed to Gideon with the studied casualness of a man who'd been told not to draw attention to it. She watched Gideon read it from across the room. His face gave almost nothing, but almost was not nothing. She was good at reading him by now, the slight compression around his eyes that meant something significant, the particular set of his jaw when he was deciding something. He handed her the letter. It was brief. 2 paragraphs from someone who signed only with initials. The documents had arrived. They had been reviewed by a party with the standing and interest to pursue them through appropriate channels. The process would be slow. There would be no announcement of origin. The initial contact with the relevant party, she understood this to mean Crest, had been made, informing him privately that the documents existed and were now out of any single individual's control, which meant that her value to Crest as a person to be managed and pressured had just dropped to approximately zero. The threat of the documents being released could no longer be resolved by controlling her. They were already out. She read the letter twice and then set it down on the table. "It's done," she said. "The first part," Gideon said. "The rest takes time." "But he has no reason to come after me anymore." "No." He looked at her. "No, he doesn't." She sat with this for a moment. She had been in some form of motion for 4 years, fleeing or managing or hiding or surviving, and the sudden absence of the thing she'd been running from was not as simple as relief. It was disorienting, actually, like a sound that's been present so long you've stopped hearing it, and then it stops, and the silence has a shape. "I don't know what to do with that," she said, honestly. "Nothing yet," he said. "Let it settle." That was good advice. She took it. Summer on the mountain was brief and extraordinary, a concentrated burst of warmth and growth that felt almost excessive after the months of white, the meadows coming up green, the creek running high and cold and clear. They were busy in the way summer demanded, everything that had waited through winter now requiring attention at once. More riders came through the northeast route as it opened fully, traders and settlers moving through, and word spread in the way word spreads in isolated places. There was a homestead high up, with a woman who knew medicine, and the distance was worth making if you needed help. The first settler came in July, a man from a homestead 15 miles north with a hand that had gone septic after a saw injury 2 days past when he should have sought help. She worked on his hand for 3 hours at her kitchen table while his wife sat outside with their 2 small children, and Gideon kept the children occupied with the systematic efficiency of a man who had no experience with children and was managing on logic alone. She saved the hand. She couldn't save all 4 fingers, but she saved the hand and the man's life and sent them home with wound dressings and clear instructions and a written protocol for the wife, who had sharp eyes and steady hands and would manage the follow-up care. Evelyn judged, better than most. After they left, she sat on the porch steps in the early evening and was very tired and didn't move for a while. Gideon came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. After a few minutes, he handed her a cup of coffee, already made, which meant he'd gone inside and made it while she sat here, which was the kind of thing he did now without comment or ceremony. "You couldn't save the fingers," he said. "No." "But he'll use that hand." "Yes." He was quiet. She drank the coffee and looked at the meadow going golden in the evening light, at the mountains above it, at the enormous undecorated fact of the sky. "I want to make this official," she said. He turned to look at her. "Which part?" "The medical work. I've been writing to a physician in Denver, Dr. Marcus Hale, who has been sympathetic to the question of women in medicine for some years. If I can document my practice through this year, cases, outcomes, methodology, he's willing to submit my record for consideration to the Territorial Medical Board under a new provision they're debating." "Licensure," Gideon said. "Possibly, or at minimum official recognition that allows me to work openly." She turned her cup in her hands. "It would change things. People would come from further out. We'd need to build a proper space, not just the kitchen table." He was looking at the meadow now. She watched the side of his face, trying to read the calculation happening behind it. "There's a flat section on the east side of the property," he said. "Good foundation ground. I've been thinking about expanding the storage there, but a separate structure would make more sense if you're seeing patients." She looked at him. He was still looking at the meadow. "You've been thinking about it," she said. "Since the man with the septic hand, before that, actually." He paused. "Since about February." She held that. February was when the riders had come back. February was when she'd laid out the full shape of Harlan Crest and what he held over her and what they were going to do about it. February was when something had completed itself between them in a way neither had announced because neither of them was built for announcements. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. There were things she could say, things about what the last year had been, about who she'd been when she came off that stagecoach in silk gloves and who she was now, about the specific geography of how she had come to be sitting on these porch steps in the mountain summer drinking coffee with this man who had almost left her standing in the street in Ash Hollow and had turned out to be the most honest and sturdy person she had ever known. She didn't say most of it. They were not people who made speeches at each other. "Thank you," she said, "for the structure you haven't built yet." "Thank you," he said, "for the fingers you couldn't save." She understood what he meant. Not the fingers themselves, but the effort, the showing up, the doing what you could with what you had in the time you had, even when what you could do wasn't everything. She looked back at the meadow. A hawk was working the updraft above the south ridge, riding it in long, patient circles without effort, the way things moved when they'd found the current that fit them. "The parsnips are doing better than I expected," she said. "They are," he agreed. "I was wrong about the parsnips." "You were wrong about a few things." "I was." He said it without defensiveness. "Just a fact," admitted cleanly. "So was I," she said, because she had come up this mountain thinking she was hiding, thinking this was the end of something, the shrinking of her life down to whatever shape could fit inside a man's cabin in a place nobody would look for her. She had been wrong about that. The mountain had not been a hiding place. It had been, in the way of things you don't recognize until you're already inside them, the first place she had ever been fully what she was. A woman who knew things and used them, who broke ice and hauled water and sutured torn muscle and cut timber and stood at a stable corner in January with a rifle in her cold hands, without any part of herself in contradiction with any other part. That was not a small thing. She understood it was not a small thing. Later that evening, after the supper dishes were done and the light had gone the deep blue of mountain dusk, she went to her trunks and opened the first one. She ran her hand over the instrument roll, the medicine case, the 400 pages of her own handwriting. Then she reorganized the whole trunk with more room. The trunks didn't need to hold everything she was anymore, because what she was now had a whole mountain to spread into, and a room to be built on flat ground to the east, and a man asleep across the cabin who had never once, after the first day in Ash Hollow, asked her to be smaller than she was. She closed the trunk. Outside, the mountain held its dark and its cold and its extraordinary star-packed sky, and the fire burned in the stove, and the creek ran in the meadow below, and none of it was perfect. The winter would come back. It always came back. And the work was never finished, and there would be more men with infected hands and more timber to cut and more mornings where the fire died in the night and had to be coaxed back up from nothing. But there was no version of a life without those things. There was only the question of whether you were the right person for what your particular life asked of you. She had spent a long time being afraid that she wasn't. She was done being afraid of that. She went to bed. She slept without interruption until morning, and in the morning she got up and built the fire.